Continuing on with our outstanding guest speaker series, today the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab is proud to present Lisa Dougherty. Lisa has been active in tracing the history of not only her own family, but many others for 25 years. An upstate New York native, she became interested in genealogy as a teenager when her father began investigating the origins of his Irish great-grandparents. A former volunteer at the National Archives in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, she continues to volunteer virtually by taking questions all day every Wednesday on her Facebook page, Upstate New York Genealogy by Lisa Dougherty. She is a member of the Association of Professional Genealogists and the genealogist in residence for the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany, New York. She resides in Guilderland, New York, with her husband and teenage son. And for more information, please visit her website at www.upstategenealogy.com. So without further ado, I would like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Lisa Dougherty.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I have to say I'm very impressed with your class here. This is wonderful. All of the links that you're sharing, it's really a great thing. So I'm very, very honored to be able to speak today for everybody. And I'm going to go ahead and get my screen ready to share here. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to speak to everybody. It sounds like this is a wonderful class, and I really love to have the opportunity to reach out and to speak to other people. As Suzanne mentioned in her introduction, I'm coming to you from upstate New York today, and it turned out to be a beautiful day. It didn't start out that way, but it's pretty nice now. And it's interesting for me to be speaking to people who reside in all over the country and in New York and not in New York. So that's very interesting for me. All right, so today we're going to talk about immigration. So immigration is kind of a topic that a lot of us end up dealing with when we're researching our ancestors. Most of the people in this country, unless they're native to this area, to this country, came from somewhere else. So eventually, a lot of us end up looking into immigrant ancestors. It doesn't matter where you live in the country. There are lots of ancestors that are going to have come from somewhere else, whether they came from on a boat, on a plane, however they got here, they will be immigrants. One of the things about immigrant ancestors, though, that keeps coming up is that there's a lot of myths out there. There are a lot of stories that people tell. There are a lot of things that people go around and they say, oh, I heard this and I heard that. So I decided that I wanted to put together a program to kind of address some of these myths and give away more accurate information about them. So when you do start looking for your immigrant ancestors, you are not looking in a place where you won't find information. Instead, you're looking in a place where you will. So I like to start out with a quote from Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt was definitely one of our greatest presidents. And he was also one of the more eloquent of our presidents. And definitely he's telling us and he's reminding us that all of us have this immigrant past. Remember always that all of us, and you and I especially, are descended from immigrants and revolutionists. So I guess all immigrants in their own way were revolutionists in that they were willing to take a chance and to come to a different country from where they lived and to settle and to make a life in America. People are still doing that to this day. So we like to think of our ancestors as adventurers, as revolutionists, as people that gave up a bad way of life or a way of life that wasn't working for them and came to a country where they could reinvent themselves, where they could join family already here, or where they could just make a new life, a new and better life for their family. And of course, as genealogists, we want to find out as much as we can about the process that led them from their old country to where they lived when they came as immigrants. So probably the number one myth that I hear a lot and that is perpetuated quite a lot is that if you were an immigrant and you came to the United States, that you had to go through Ellis Island. Well, Ellis Island is probably the best known port of all of the immigration ports. It's also the port that had the most immigrants that came through, but it was certainly not the only one. And there was no requirement that said you had to go through Ellis Island. Even during the Ellis Island era, it was not a requirement that you go through Ellis Island. Ellis Island was just simply the best known and the largest port in the United States. Ellis Island only operated roughly from 1892 to 1924. So those are fairly stringent time period. Most people tend to think of the Ellis Island era as the era from when the country was formed in the 1780s to basically up to the 1950s. But the fact is that Ellis Island did not operate that entire time, and it operated less than half of that time. It was a place for immigrants to land from 1892 to 1897. Then there was a fire, which took it out of commission for a few years. Then it came back online and stayed online from 1900 to 1924. And in 1924, Ellis Island officially closed. It doesn't mean the Port of New York closed. It just means that Ellis Island closed. So really, in the grand scheme of things, Ellis Island only operated for about not quite 30 years. So in the history of immigration of the United States, that's not a very long time. Of course, immigrants were arriving in New York way prior to Ellis Island's opening. And any of the New York arrivals before 1892, most of the New York arrivals before 1892 were processed through a facility called Castle Garden. There were also some other New York State-run facilities that were involved around the period of time before Ellis Island. About 12 million immigrants who came to the United States went through Ellis Island, which is a very impressive number and definitely the largest number of immigrants that came through any port. So it is definitely the best known port, and it is the port that most people will refer to when they refer to their immigrant ancestor. But if we think about it, there was another 12 million that passed through New York either before or after the Ellis Island era. So it actually would be much more accurate to say if your ancestor arrived in New York, that your ancestor arrived in New York and not through Ellis Island. So the difference between New York and Ellis Island is the difference of what year you're talking about. Of course, New York was not the only port where immigrants arrived. These are just some of the numbers for some of the better known ports. Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Orleans, San Francisco. A lot of these ports were also very important ports when it came to immigration. People arrived at other North American ports. Also in Canada, people arrived. So there are lots of different places where immigrants can arrive. So don't think that you need to limit your search to just Ellis Island or to just New York. If you're not finding anything in that port, try these others. You may find something in one of those. Another myth that I hear all the time: names were changed when immigrants arrived in the U.S. by inspection officials. This is a very, very often repeated myth. It's actually quite common for people's names to be slightly altered or even drastically altered from what they were originally using before they immigrated. And there are lots of reasons for that. But one of the reasons doesn't happen to be that official people changed the name. The process for coming to this country included the making of the passenger list. The passenger lists were made where the people got on the boats. So if you got on the boat in Bremen, Germany, the passenger list was made when you got on the boat from the name that was on your ticket. So if you were issued a ticket in your home port, generally that ticket would be in the name that you used when you were getting on the boat. Now, of course, you didn't have to use your real name. Some people did deliberately change their name. But most people, when they were issued a ticket, were given a ticket under their name. That ticket was given to the person making the passenger list. And those people were local. They were local employees. They knew the people that lived nearby. They were fairly familiar with the language, so they could write the name as they saw it on the ticket on the passenger list. Now, just because they wrote the name on the passenger list doesn't mean that it was spelled correctly. It doesn't mean that it's going to be some handwriting that someone today can read. It doesn't mean that it was transcribed correctly or indexed correctly by the people who transcribed or indexed these passenger lists. So keep in mind that these passenger lists have many layers to go through before they get to our eyes. They go through the layer of the person who's writing the original name down. They go through the layer of the person who is keeping the record for posterity. They go through the layer of the person who is reading the list in order to interpret it and transcribe it. They go through the layer of the people who are indexing the transcription. So there's several layers there, making passenger lists very difficult to search. In general, original names were used on the manifest, the name that the boarding ticket was issued under. And once an immigrant got to this country, or even before, they may choose to change their name, and there were lots of reasons for that. They may have been choosing to change their name to be more Americanized. If their name was very difficult to pronounce, if it was very difficult to say, they may have changed their name to be something that would make them assimilate into the American culture more easily. Also, sometimes people may have chosen to change their name to hide their past. That was certainly something that happened. So there were lots of reasons why people changed their names, and it definitely happened. An example of what a passenger ticket might look like, of course, back in those days, everything was handwritten. You would purchase your ticket. If you were not literate and could not write yourself, a clerk would write the name and the date and the name of the ship that you were going to come on. So these types of documents would have been something that you would have been issued, and a passenger list would have been made from this ticket. So again, we're going through another layer here. We're going through a layer of the person who wrote the ticket out to the person that's writing the name on the passenger list. So we have lots of layers of interpretation to go through here. So another thing that we are led to believe when we're researching our immigrant ancestry is that, when they immigrated, there was lots of hardship. It was a long and difficult journey. They had to sleep in a ship along with thousands of other people, and conditions were harsh. And to a certain extent, that is definitely true. Our earlier immigrants would have had to endure a very long crossing across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe or from wherever they came from. That would have been a months-long passage. But the majority of the immigrants to this country came in the later 19th century and the early 20th century. And by that time, the immigration process was just a little bit different than it was in the early days. The average Atlantic crossing time in the 1860s was from 30 to 40 days, so about a month. But it had reduced to 6 to 12 days by the 1890s. And if we think about the Ellis Island Era, which lasted roughly from 1892 to 1924, and the 12 million people that came to this country during that time, they could have expected a journey of about 6 to 12 days, so a little bit less than 2 weeks. So still not the most comfortable trip on the planet, but definitely not as bad as the months-long trip that would have happened earlier in the 19th century. A steerage ticket, which would have been third class, would have cost about $25 in the 1890s. And yes, $25 was a lot of money. But if you thought about it, if someone was going to make a one-way trip, if they were just coming to this country and were going to stay here, they would save up for the amount of money, the $25, and they would have paid that money gladly to be able to come here. A lot of the immigrants that came here were coming here to join someone that was already here, and that's a process known as chain migration. A lot of times they would have heard from people that we were either related to them or friends of theirs that had already come to the United States, and those people would have been able to tell them something about the experience. So they would have been at least a little bit familiar with what was going to happen to them when they got on the boat and came here. Passengers had to go through legal and health inspections, and those would take about 3 hours. And this is quoting from the Ellis Island experience. So people that were coming through Ellis Island would have cleared their legal and health inspections within about 3 hours. So if you were traveling, depending on what traveling class you traveled from, Europe or wherever you came from, that would determine a lot about your Ellis Island experience. Generally, if you were a first or second class passenger, you would have paid a little bit more for your ticket. And yes, some immigrants did come in first, maybe not first, but also second class passengers. you would have had a very cursory inspection aboard the ship. You would not have had to be subject to the rigorous kind of inspection that you would have gotten if you were a steerage passenger. And you would have been allowed to get off the boat and enter the United States. The general consensus was that it was thought if you could afford a first or second class ticket, you were less likely to become a burden to society. So therefore, you were kind of just given a quick glance and said, okay, you're fine, you can now proceed to your destination. However, if you were a steerage passenger, the process was a little more stringent. You would have had to remain on board the ship until the first and second passengers had disembarked. Then you would board a shuttle or a ferry to the Ellis Island processing station. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Ellis Island. There's something called the Great Hall there, and that would have been where people would have lined up to be inspected. Health and legal inspections were then conducted, and they would take usually several minutes each. And when we talk about a legal inspection would have been, do you have any money with you? Are you going to join anyone? Is there anyone here to meet you? So all of those would have been questions that would have covered the legal aspect of the inspection. Reasons that people were detained. Well, if they had a contagious disease, or if the legal inspector felt that they were likely to become a public charge. So someone that was arriving with no money or no contacts, they would possibly be detained. And Suzanne mentioned earlier in one of the announcements that the New York GNB is going to be giving a free webinar about interpreting some of the codes that are on the passenger list. This would be an area where those codes would fall in. If someone was detained, there may be a code affixed to their name on the passenger list. So that would be a great webinar to go to follow up. At the end of the day, only about 2% of immigrants were excluded from entry. So if you do see an entry with your ancestor on a passenger list that indicates that they were detained, that would certainly be a really good thing to get your hands on for more information. So another myth that I hear quite often. Most immigrants never return to their native country. Well, that is true and not true. I think most of us think of the immigrant experience as people get on a boat, they come to the United States, they settle in the United States, and they stay here. And that's sort of the picture that we get for our ancestors. It's part of the tunnel vision that we have. We sort of assume that once they arrived here, they didn't go back. The truth is that there are a few ethnic groups that were kind of more likely to go back and forth. And ethnic groups that were least likely to return to their homelands were Irish, Germans, or Jews. And we can think about the reasons for that. To a certain extent, a lot of those groups were in some ways persecuted. So they weren't very likely to go back to their homeland. Generally, I find, and generally it's true, that the later the immigrant came, the more likely that immigrant would have been to go back to their homeland. And that was simply a reason of economics and also convenience. Faster and less expensive travel in the 20th century would have allowed for more frequent crossings. So if you were, say, an Irish immigrant who came here in the early 1900s, you may have been able to come here and get a job and live for a while, and then maybe afford to be able to go home and visit your family because the crossings were less expensive and they required less time. I've seen in some of the Irish families that I've researched that sometimes they will come to this country, they will get married in the United States, and then they will go back to Ireland and have a couple of their children, for example. So these were options for immigrants in the early 20th century. Sometimes immigrant groups would come over and they would work seasonally. So the Italians were some of these people that would do that. They would come over and they would work seasonally in the United States, and then they would return home with the earnings that they had. Sometimes they would do this for several years. And then when they felt they had saved up enough money, they would stay permanently in the United States and send for their family. So seasonal work is definitely something to look out for. Sometimes people will find their immigrant ancestors on multiple passenger lists, and they'll be confused by this. They'll think, am I looking at more than one person with this name, or am I looking at the same person? A lot of times you will be looking at the same person, somebody that has come back and forth for either seasonal work or just because they have not quite decided if they're going to permanently settle in the United States. So it is something that does happen. Also, things like family catastrophes could happen, and that would prompt them to return home. So there's lots of reasons why an immigrant would decide to go home again. There's an estimate that about 30% of people that initially came to the United States intending to settle here returned to their homelands either permanently or for a visit. And yes, there are definitely stories of people that come to this country intending to stay here, and it doesn't work out, and they return home. So that's something that you should also keep in mind. Sometimes some people in the family will remain, other times other people in the family will go back. So it's kind of a back and forth thing. It's not all everyone comes here and just stays here. Another thing that people think about too, and they wonder about, is was it a requirement to be a U.S. citizen to own property or to start a business? Well, we think about the current climate in our country today, and things that we argue about in this country about should illegal aliens be allowed to get driver's licenses, etc. Well, this is a debate that's been going on for a long time. But really, in the distant past, the laws were varied from state to state. In general, full citizenship was not a requirement to start a business or own property. So if you were here in this country, you were able to start your own business, you were able to buy a house, you were able to buy land. Immigrants were encouraged to come here, to settle. At one time, this country was mainly on the East Coast, and the West was a very large open territory. And it was one of the policies of the U.S. government to get people to come here to settle in the West. And they advertised in European countries for settlers to come here. So it was obviously not going to have to be a requirement to be a full citizen to own your own property or to start a business. One of the process of citizenship was a two-part process. The first thing you had to do was you had to file a declaration of intention, which was exactly as it said. It told a court that you were intending to become a full citizen of the United States. There would be a residency requirement attached to that document. You would have had to have resided in the United States continuously for a certain amount of time. Again, it varied from location to location. The early laws of the United States gave a time period in which the alien had to file the final papers. And these laws were repealed in the early 20th century. And this was because people moved around. Sometimes they would file their declaration of intention and then never go in and do the final papers for citizenship. It would have required a second appearance in court. Sometimes they didn't do that. So the laws that were repealed in the early 20th century, giving people a little bit more wiggle room as to when they would have gone to court to get their full citizenship. Another thing that really impacted immigration in this country was something called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act in 1862 was passed by Congress, and that freed up millions of acres in the West to allow settlement by immigrants and from anyone who wanted to settle in lands in the West. So Congress actively encouraged people to come from different countries and to lay down claims and to stake their claims in the western part of this country. Those people would have come here, they would have been able to get their land, and they would have been able to farm it. And there was a period of time that they would have had to improve the land, and at the end of that period of time, they would have been able to have that land be in their name. So that's something that would be very interesting to think about. If your ancestor arrived here in the mid-1860s or in the early 1870s, it may have been a result of seeing an ad like this for land available. So to continue on the citizenship theme, one of the things that we think about is that if my ancestors served in the military, they would have been able to become a U.S. citizen. Well, that's true because they were allowed to become U.S. citizens after serving in the military, but there was a little bit of a process to it, so it wasn't just automatic. Again, some of the wars, during some of the wars, and most especially during the Civil War, there would have been some recruitment. There would have been people recruiting for both the Union Army and the Confederate Army. In places, in European countries, in other countries, there would have been some sort of recruitment for people to join the Army. U.S. citizenship would have been one of the benefits that would have been advertised to potential recruits, saying, if you come and you serve honorably in the United States military, we will allow you to become a citizen. A law in 1862 waived the Declaration of Intention requirement. So we were just talking about the Declaration of Intention, which was the first attempt that an immigrant would make to go to court and let the court know that they wanted to become a U.S. citizen. Well, in 1862, if you were serving with the Union Army, you were allowed to waive that Declaration of Intention. So when you were discharged from the Army, you would just go to the court with your proof of honorable discharge, and you would be granted citizenship. So the kicker here would be that you would have to have been honorably discharged, and you also would have had to prove that honorable discharge in order to become a citizen. And this is a copy of a document that was an affidavit for an Irish person, Andrew Dougherty, who became a U.S. citizen based on the service that he provided to the Union Army in the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry. So if your ancestor came from another country and served in the Civil War, you might want to try to see if you can find any kind of information like this about their citizenship. Were they granted citizenship based on their Army service? That's something that you can look into and perhaps find out about. So also in the vein of citizenship, people are interested in finding naturalization papers, and they can be incredibly helpful. Naturalization papers can tell you a lot about your ancestors' immigrant experience, or they can tell you very little. It just depends on the time period and the situation. So what if you had a great-grandmother or a great-grandmother who arrived here in the 1890s? Where would you find her naturalization papers? Well, the truth of the matter is that females were not required to file their own naturalizations until 1919. And that was because in 1919, that was when women were granted the right to vote. Before that time, women didn't have the right to vote, but they were granted what was known as derivative citizenship under their husband. So if you were a female that arrived here with your husband from another country, you would have been considered a U.S. citizen through his act of naturalization. And the same would go for minor children. So if you and your husband had been married in another country and came here with your children, as long as your children were minors, they would be granted derivative citizenship under the auspices of their husband or a father. And they would not have separate paperwork of their own. After women were given the right to vote in 1919, then they would have had to file for their own citizenship. An example of this is that my husband's great-grandparents came from Poland, and his great-grandfather died very young. His great-grandmother, after his great-grandfather died, found that in order for her to vote, she had to go and get her own citizenship. So she was able to do that, and she was able to register to vote, and she lived 40 years after he died. So it was very important for her to get her own citizenship. So just keep that in mind. If your female ancestor lived into the 19th century, into the 20th century, then it would have been a possibility that she would have gotten her own citizenship. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the United States. So if you were a child of immigrants, if you were born after your parents arrived in the United States, then you would be automatically given United States citizenship. So you would not have to file for naturalization if your parents were foreign born, if you were born in the United States. And that's a law that's been in effect since 1868. So another thing that I noticed that Suzanne mentioned in her announcements earlier was about the Mayflower. Well, the Mayflower is a ship that obviously we all know arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts with the Pilgrims aboard, and it's probably one of the most famous of immigrant ships, at least of the ones that made it here, not like the Titanic. And the Mayflower is something that we hear a lot here. Living in New York, living near New England, a lot of people are convinced that they have Mayflower ancestry. Well, that's one of those things that it takes a good deal of research to be able to prove. You have to be able to prove your link between yourself all the way back to 1609, and that can take a little bit of doing. So I kind of liken the Mayflower myth to the Indian princess myth that Suzanne also mentioned. So the Mayflower left England in 1620 with 120 passengers. And if you think about it, that's not a lot of people in the terms of immigrant ships. What we think of with immigrant ships, 120 people is not a lot of people. Many didn't survive the trip or the first winter in the New World. And as we know, and you may not know this if you live in the West, but New England winters are not anything to trifle with. They're really not a lot of fun. There were only 26 heads of families who arrived on the Mayflower that are known to have left descendants. So we're only talking about 26 people here that are known to have left descendants. And the original Mayflower only made the one voyage. So that's 120 people total on one voyage. The estimation is that there's about 35 million people worldwide who are descendants of Mayflower passengers. So if you can count yourself in the 35 million, then possibly you may have Mayflower ancestry. Again, like I was mentioning, it takes a good deal of painstaking research to be able to connect yourself all the way back to 1620 to the passengers of the Mayflower. If you have reason to believe that you may be connected with the Mayflower, I would urge you to contact the Mayflower Society. They have people that can help you with that research. They have people that are experts, so they will be able to guide you through that. And maybe you may be one of the lucky 35 million people who can tie yourself to the Mayflower. So we've heard a lot about the myths, a lot about what kinds of things may not be true about the immigrant process. So what can you do personally to find out about your immigrant ancestry? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to get a handle of a good idea on when your ancestor may have arrived here. And one of the things that people tend to do is they tend to search in generalities. They tend to say, well, my ancestor arrived sometime around 1900. They don't really have any specific dates. And one thing I would urge you to do is to come up with some guidelines, to come up with some definite, more definite dates. Because passenger lists being what they are, they're not going to give up their information to you very easily. You're going to have to do quite a bit of digging, and you're going to have to figure out when exactly those people came. One of the things that I do is I deal with Irish immigrants a lot, and Irish immigrants tend to have fairly common names, names that we hear over and over, like Kelly and Murphy and Sullivan. And if you've seen one Michael Sullivan on a passenger list, then you've seen one Michael Sullivan on a passenger list. There could be as many as 50 or 60 or 70 Michael Sullivans in a given year on a passenger list. So you really need to narrow down that year. Census records give us really good clues about when people came over. One of the things that I hear a lot from people is, I didn't realize that census records gave me an idea of when my ancestor may have gotten here. Well, the truth is that the census records from 1930, 1920, 1910, and 1900 all have the place to put a year of immigration on them. So that's something that you should be looking at. If you can find your immigrant ancestor in any of those census records, they will provide you with a year of immigration. Now, that's not saying that all of those years will not say the same year. They may not. It just depends. But at least you're going to be able to get a better ballpark figure of that particular year of when your ancestor arrived. Another thing that might give you a clue would be a naturalization record, if you can get your hands on a naturalization record, and especially some of our later naturalization records. A pivotal date to remember when it comes to naturalization and even passenger lists is the year 1906. Prior to 1906, immigration records were scattered to the wild winds. They were in the hands of whatever court decided to do naturalizations. The passenger lists were held in local custody. So before 1906, we have a lot of fluctuation in where we can find the records, who issued the records, how good the records are, the availability of the records. So there's a lot of variables before 1906. After 1906, the records became the jurisdiction of the federal government. So they became better organized. The forms became standardized. The places they were issued from became standardized. The repositories they were stored at became standardized. So after 1906, your chances of finding a passenger list or a naturalization record for your ancestor are going to be much greater than prior to 1906. So declarations of intention like this one for Luther Reed can show us lots of information. They can tell us the name of a ship that the person came on. They can tell us the date that the person arrived. Keep in mind, this document is based on the memory of the person who's giving the information. So if this person is filling out this document many years after the actual events, their memory may not be too good. However, it's probably better than just guessing. So definitely worth it if you can get a hold of a document like this. So when we search passenger lists, where can we search for them? Where are good places to search? There are the obvious ones: Ancestry, Family Search, the Ellis Island Records website. Castle Garden also has a website, although recently I've heard it may possibly have been taken down. I haven't checked recently, but that might be something that might have happened. Years ago, there was a website called the Immigrant Ships Transcribers Guild. They started before any of these big websites had the passenger lists on them, so they would have transcriptions of early ship lists. And the same with the Olive Tree genealogy page, made an effort of getting some of those really early passenger lists online. Addresses for all of these websites are provided on the handout. And if they don't show up on the handout, let me know and I will definitely get them to you. But these are good places to search passenger lists.
Garden isn't on here.
One thing I want to point out to you, if you are going to search passenger lists, this is a website that you cannot afford to live without. This is a website of a gentleman called Steve Morse. He is a computer person who develops search engines for websites that have less than stellar search engines. And one of those less than stellar search engines is on the Ellis Island website. It's very difficult to search that website for your Ellis Island passenger. It doesn't give you a lot of parameters. It doesn't allow you to work with variations in spelling very easily. So what Steve Morse has done is Steve has made a search form for the Ellis Island website. You can go to Steve's website, you can click on the Ellis Island Gold Form website, and that will bring up a search engine for you to search for your immigrant ancestor. You can put as much information as you want or as little information in it as you want. It allows for partial names. It allows for lots of different possibilities. So I highly recommend it if you're going to be searching passenger lists to use anything that Steve Morse has developed. Definitely worth it, worth your time. So I would have to say, of all genealogy records, passenger lists are probably among the most difficult to search. And then there's a lot of reasons why. They tend to be one of the most sought after of records for genealogists. I used to volunteer at the National Archives in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and one of probably the number one thing that people came into the search room looking for were passenger lists. So, if 5 people came in, probably 3 of them were looking for passenger lists. So that being what it is, passenger lists are one of the more difficult record sets to search, and also probably one of the more disappointing record sets to search, simply because a lot of time gets spent on them for not a lot of yield. There's a lot of reasons why you may have a hard time finding out about your immigrant ancestor and finding them on a passenger list. One of the things that we talked about earlier in this presentation were the many layers that have to be gone through before you start searching. So the distance between your ancestor getting on the boat to you searching for their name on a passenger list is way more than 100 years or 150 years. It's more like light years away because of what happens in between. So we've got a lot of layers of interpretation that we have to go through. So is it no wonder that we have a hard time searching these documents? Spelling, difficult handwriting, we've all encountered these kinds of things in our genealogy searches. Poor indexing, someone trying to read the handwriting of something that's spelled completely wrong and then trying to index it for one of these giant websites. Incomplete records. Incomplete records is a really big problem. The passenger lists tend to be one of the more incomplete record sets. And we talked about before 1906 and the way these records were stored. There was no central repository. They got shoved into closets. They got put into boxes. They were misplaced. They were mishandled. So there was no central place where passenger lists were being put for posterity. They were just kind of put all over the place, and then at a later date, someone tried to round them all up. So there's a lot of problems in locating these records. You may have the wrong port, you may have the wrong date. Those are always possibilities. You may not have all of the information that you need to go searching. Or you may just simply be inexperienced with database searching. I would have to say, in general, the number one reason that people don't find what they're looking for in any database searching, whether it be passenger lists or census lists, is because they give up too easily. I always like to tell people that if I do 10 searches, 7 of them are unsuccessful. It's being determined and keeping at it. That's how you find what you're looking for. So that's something that's just a little tidbit that I've always found useful. So there are many reasons why you're not finding your immigrant ancestor, and probably most of them don't have to do with you. So if you're interested in the topic of immigration, if you're interested in finding out about your immigrant ancestor, I can highly recommend this book. And this may be a book that Suzanne has in her genealogy library. They Came in Ships, A Guide to Finding Your Immigrant Ancestor's Arrival Record by John Philip Coletta. This book is invaluable. It has pretty much every kind of bit of information that you ever wanted to know about ancestors, and about their immigrant experience. One thing that it's particularly strong with is where to find these resources. Now, when this book first came out, this was before the majority of everything was online, so that book would reflect where to find things in libraries. The later editions now will tell you about websites and databases where you can find this information. But one of the things that it also addresses is it addresses gaps in the record. It addresses things like, well, we know from 1820 to 1825 we don't have any records for the Port of Boston. So you may have been looking in the Port of Boston during that time period, and you may be becoming frustrated because you're not finding anything about your ancestor. And that could be because there is a known gap in the record. And that's one of those things that is addressed in this book. It also addresses the immigrant process. It addresses a lot of the situations that our ancestors would have been in when they were coming to this country. It talks about the different time periods and the differences to the immigrant experience. So I would highly recommend this book if you are interested in the topic. So another thing we need to ask ourselves is, when we're searching for a passenger list, is it really going to be worth our time and effort to search for it? Because sometimes we search for a record, we search high and low, and finally when we find it, or we think we found it, it doesn't give us the kind of information that we're looking for. Well, I can tell you the difference in passenger lists from the various time periods are really going to probably make a determination as to whether you search or how hard you search. So, for example, the record on the left is a passenger list that's typical of the mid-19th century. It gives people's names, it gives their ages, which are highly approximate, it gives their gender, it gives a kind of an occupation, if you want to call servant or laborer or child an occupation. It tells where they're from, Ireland, it tells where they're going, United States, and it tells that they're a steerage passenger. So really there's not a lot of distinguishing information about these passengers on this passenger list. If you're looking, for example, for that Timothy Sullivan, that might be your Timothy Sullivan, it might not be. There's not a lot of information there to tell you for sure, one way or the other. By the time we get to the 20th century, we're talking about much more detail in the passenger list. And again, the federal government has taken over the management of passenger lists by 1906. And so they start to ask more questions. They start to ask more detailed questions. So in this instance, if we're looking for a passenger that came after 1906, or even after about, it's going to give us a lot more information about our ancestor. And we're going to be able to possibly tell that, yes, this is our Timothy Sullivan and not one of the 700 other Timothy Sullivans that came the same year. So the later the passenger record, the more detail it's going to have, and the better the possibility that you're going to be able to identify your ancestor on the record. So we talked about 1906. A little bit of the history of where the passenger lists were, how they ended up. Prior to 1820, we're talking about a brand new country, the United States. The individual colonies and states took care of their immigration records. From 1820 to 1891, the United States Customs Service took care of the immigration records, but again, not very organized. New York papers may have stayed in New York. Boston papers may have stayed in Boston, but the Customs Service was not very careful with what they did with those records. From 1891 to now, the United States Immigration Service was formed, and they took over. But the laws really became uniform in 1906. That's when everything kind of gelled and came together, and the process was more streamlined. So 1906 is the year that you want to keep in mind when you're looking through these records. So what other information, what other sources can we look at that might give us some information about our ancestor and their immigration? Well, a couple of examples here, and these are some of the databases that are available on websites like Ancestry or Family Search. Alien registration form. If you were an alien and you were living in the United States between 1940 and 1944, the government told you that you had to fill out an alien registration form. Now, a lot of immigrants would have naturalized, and so they would not have been eligible to fill this out, but if your ancestor did not naturalize, they would have been required by law to fill out one of these alien registration forms. So that's something to take a look at. It will give information about their immigration. As well as a passport application. If your ancestor became a United States citizen and wanted to travel out of the country, they would have needed a passport, same as what you and I do today. So they would have applied for a passport, and those passport applications are available up to 1925 on Ancestry. Another thing that you might think about is that possibly your ancestor may have traveled abroad, not because they were an immigrant, but because they were going to visit relatives in another country. So that's a good way of finding out a little bit about relatives in a different country, is if your ancestor traveled to meet someone in a different country, and they would have had to get a passport, so this might be a place to look. Also, Canadian border crossings. Before 1895, the border with Canada was fairly porous. People just came and went, did their own thing. After 1895, people going back and forth across the border were required to keep manifests, similar to ship manifests, of their crossings from Canada to the United States. So sometimes people would come from Europe to Canada, stay there for a little while, and then come to the United States. So that's a possible route that your ancestor may have taken. So that's a good place to check if you haven't been able to find anything anywhere else. It's a good place to check the Canadian border crossings. And again, those did not start being recorded until 1895. Okay, so that about wraps up what I've got to say today. So if anybody's got questions, I would love to answer a few.
Okay, that was wonderful, Lisa. While I'm waiting for the class, and I would encourage the class to go ahead and type into the chat box. I know one of the questions early on was that if you could go over your email address, because on the slide they couldn't quite see it very well. So maybe you could go ahead and put that in the chat box, Lisa, for everyone to grab.
Yes, I can do. Yep, I can do that. So I will put my email address here. There it is. And I'll also put my my website in here too.
Yeah, in fact, if you'd like to bring up your website and spend a moment showing the class your website.
Well, it's actually not the most interesting website in the world, I can tell you that, because I've been trying to get it done over. I'll just talk about it. I don't update it. I do update it weekly. I update it with the things that I do around the area that I live in. I also do a few things online, and one of the things I wanted to mention is on Monday, this coming Monday, which I believe is August 10th, I will be doing a talk called Choosing and Using Genealogy Software. So if anybody's interested in that, they can find it at the Clifton Park Library website. And if I can find a link to that, I can put that up. Okay.
And that's a free webinar?
It is a free webinar. You just have to register, and you'll find the information on their webpage. And if I can get it, I will put it up here. That's a free webinar. I've been doing webinars for them every month, and once a month I do one, and this month's topic is genealogy software. That in here.
And I just want to let the class know, if you want, you can download the chat. So if you didn't grab the URLs right now, you can download everything all at one time by just clicking on those three little dots that says download chat in the bottom right hand corner of the chat box.
All right, let me just get the right link here. I think I gave you the wrong one. All right, here we go. All right. No, it just is not giving me the right one. Okay, hang on. I might have to do it in a different browser because it's not giving me the right browser, right link. So if anybody's got any questions, please feel free to ask.
Well, while we're waiting for the class, I wanted to kind of mention a few things that you talked about during your presentation. Our library does have the John Collada book, We Came in Ships. We do have it. We also have a couple more of his books. Like offhand, I don't remember the titles, but we do have, I think we have 3 books of his. And we also have the 16-volume set of great courses on Introduction to Genealogy that he did. And if you've never watched his multi-volume set of great courses, I would encourage everybody in my class to watch it. It is outstanding, absolutely outstanding.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, our library has that in streaming video. We also have that. We also have it in DVD as well. One of my students donated that DVD collection about 8 months ago, I think it was. And then let's see here. You had mentioned that the date of 1906. For the records that were prior to 1906, were they ever collected and put in one place?
Well, I think the National Archives attempted to do that, yes. So the collections that are in the National Archives that are reflected in the collections of Family Search and Ancestry, that's their attempt at getting things together. So the National Archives did make that attempt, and that's where those records that were microfilmed and were indexed for Ancestry and Family Search would be those records. But again, it's the kind of thing that there was really no central repository, so they're kind of all over the place.
And I know some of the people who've been coming to my class for several years now, they are familiar with some of the places that you mentioned, because some of our guest speakers in the past have been a park ranger from Angel Island in San Francisco. Stephen Morse has given 2 in-person presentations to my class. We've also had a remote webinar with Ellis Island, a representative from Ellis Island, and we also, with the National Park Service, we just, I think 2 weeks ago, we had a speaker who talked about the Homestead Act.
Excellent. Very good.
Definitely, if you've been coming to my class for any length of time, you've have more to build on from what you talked about today.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
I also wanted to let the class know our library does have several books on the history of Ellis Island. If that's something you're interested in, let me know. Right now, we're not checking out books to community patrons because of the virus, but maybe I can work with people one-on-one to get that book to you if you're interested. Now, you mentioned that Ancestry.com, Family Search, they all have access to various amounts of the records. But where do you find the non-Ellis Island records? Where do you go when you're looking, when you're doing a case for someone, where do you go for non-Ellis Island records? Where's your go-to place?
Well, generally I start with Steve Morse and his search engines. He has his records, his search engines will search all the New York passenger lists. So you don't just have to be limited to Ellis Island. It will search all of them. And I believe it's searching Ancestry when it's searching them. So, I have a subscription to Ancestry. So generally I go to Ancestry, but also they are available at Family Search. So I do occasionally use that too, just for a difference with the search engine. They tend to be a little bit different. So sometimes you get a little bit more wiggle room with Family Search than you tend to get with Ancestry. So I just use whatever one I happen to be working with that day.
Great advice. Okay. Now, Sarah in the chat box wanted to know about derivative citizenship. Were unmarried women allowed to come in or receive it?
Well, unmarried women wouldn't have needed to receive it really because they didn't vote. They were not allowed to vote. So there was no reason for them even really to become a citizen. You could, obviously, if you got married and you married an American citizen, then you would become a citizen. Now, I know that at some point in time, and I'm pretty sure John Philip Coletta goes into this in his book, there was a period of time when if you were a woman who was an American citizen and you married someone who was an alien, you renounced your American citizenship. And I think that this law was only for a brief period of time. But it's definitely something that to be aware of. And, you could spend hours trying to figure out the ins and outs of all of the immigration laws over the years and who was eligible for citizenship when. But generally, if you were a woman, you would not have need of citizenship because you did not have the right to vote until 1919. After that, you would have wanted to get your citizenship if you were voting. Well, you would have had to, so.
Okay, and where would my students go to find the Declaration of Intention Papers? Would that be the National Archives?
That's going to depend on the year. So if you are searching for the first papers of someone who filed to become a citizen, generally those papers are going to be in a court nearby where they lived. So sometimes it's a county court, sometimes it's a city court. They would have performed naturalizations in federal courts. So it could be a federal court. After 1906, it will always be a federal court. So prior to 1906, it could be any of those local courts, and generally they tended to be in the areas where the immigrant lived. The immigrant did not have to file the declaration and get his final papers for citizenship in the same court. So a lot of times what we find happens is they'll get their declaration of intention in the place where they go to settle when they first get here. So say they arrived in New York, they may get their declaration of intention in New York. And then from New York, they go somewhere else, like they go to Illinois or they go to California. And then there they might get their citizenship in a court in the place where they settle later on. So the two documents do not have to be in the same place, which only just further adds to the difficulty. Yeah, it's tough.
Wow. Now, another question that I have on derivative citizenship, If you were lucky enough to find the husband's citizenship papers, what would you expect to find about his wife and or children in that same set of papers?
They will, especially on the Declaration of Intention, they will list their wife's name. A lot of times they will list their wife's name and birthday and where their wife was born. They would also list that information for themselves, and then they would also list the names and dates of birth for their minor children. So though that would be very useful information, because it will also tell you where the minor children were born. So that's very useful information. But again, these are going to be your later naturalization records. These are going to be after 1906. Prior to 1906, there's very little, if any, mention of family members on those papers.
Good to know. Very good to know. Now, you also mentioned one of the pitfalls in doing research in immigration records is the spelling. Obviously, that's a common problem for so many of us. How do you personally, as a professional, how do you overcome that? I mean, do you just Google a website like variations of the name Smith, or what's your go-to method of overcoming this obstacle?
I try to use the context of the record more than the actual spellings of the names. That's kind of it's kind of something that makes a lot of people squirm, because like in our 21st century eyes, we see things like the exact spellings, the exact birth dates, the exact places of birth. I try to put myself in the ancestors' shoes where, things were not really the way they are today. It was kind of possible to sail through life with very little paperwork about yourself, unlike today. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm looking and I want to try to determine, is this record somebody that I'm looking for? Is this person, the spelling doesn't look anything like what I'm used to. I try to look at the context of the record. Does the time period make sense? Does the location make sense? Do the people listed in the record with that person make sense? In other words, I know that this person that I'm looking for, that his wife's name was Mary. Does this person have a wife whose name was Mary? Does the age of the person make sense? Do the locations, does the occupation of the person make sense? So I like to look at the things around the person to see if it makes sense. It kind of all has to make sense in order for it to be real. And sometimes when we're engaging in genealogy, we use something called a reasonably exhaustive search, which means we try to check as many records about the problem that we're dealing with as possible so that we can make an informed conclusion. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, the records that we can find don't lead us to a conclusion that is 100%. We just have to go with what the records show us and what makes sense from the records. So dealing with names is sort of that same kind of theory. If it makes sense, if all of the other parts add up, then we can reasonably conclude that this record pertains to our ancestor. So it's using the context of the records, and relying on that context as much or more than spelling. So.
Good advice. In fact, our speaker last week was talking about negative evidence. In other words, how to take all the evidence that isn't something and then determine whether that is your ancestor or not. So very point well taken.
Yes, very difficult thing to do.
Okay, let's see here. I'm kind of scrolling through the chat box and I don't see any other questions. So I'll give the class just one last few moments here before we log off to ask any questions that they might have. And of course, it's all right. I assume that my students contact you directly if they have a question.
Absolutely.
Sometimes people get a little shy, or they think of the question after the class is over.
No, I'm more than happy to answer any questions. That would be wonderful, definitely. And and also you were saying earlier about I do answer questions on Wednesdays on my Facebook page, and that's Upstate NY Genealogy by Lisa Dougherty. And I basically take questions all day. So about anything. So if you have a question and you're doing your genealogy work on Wednesday and you have a question, you can run right over to my Facebook page and you can post a question to me and I'll try my best to answer it.
Wow, office hours all day. That's wonderful.
Yes, it's
That's
been since
wonderful.
COVID. So, I used to do it in person, but now with COVID, I had to come up with some way of reaching out. So it's worked out pretty well.
Well, I encourage each and every one of my students to take advantage of that because I'm not available on Wednesdays. So
Oh, there you go.
that's a
Okay.
that's a great deal. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions. So what I'll do is say thank you very, very much. And thank you also for allowing us to record today's session. And I
Very
wanted to
welcome.
let the students know it'll take about a week or so before our marketing department gets it posted up on our YouTube channel. And Lisa, I will be going ahead and sending you a link to it as soon as I get it. Like I said, sometimes it does take about a week, before they get it to me. But as soon as I do, I will, and you're more than welcome to use that for your promotional purposes as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. It was wonderful. And I'm definitely going to be tuning into your future classes. I can tell you that.
Well, thank you. Would you like me to put your name on my weekly email list?
Yes, please do.
Okay, will do. I'll be happy to do that. And then I just wanted to let the class know before, because I see some people are starting to log out. We do have another hour and 10 minutes left of class. So if there's anyone who wants to work with me one-on-one, just stay online and everybody else can go ahead and click on the red hang up button to log off, and we'll just get down to working on family trees for the next hour. So Lisa, once again, thank you very, very much. And if you'd like, you can just click on that red hang up button, and that'll disconnect you from everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.